Close to collapse, that's the stark warning from the UN as climate change talks in Bali draw to a close. The Europeans want binding targets on climate change, but the US still won't commit. So can anything break the deadlock? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. Well, with Bali hosting over 180 countries and a climate change bonanza, it looks like progress in the fight to protect the world's environment. The UN Climate Change Conference, which opened this week, marks 10 years since the Kyoto Agreement was first signed. And money is pouring in. The World Bank's pledged another $300 million. The ranks are swelling too. Australia's newly elected Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, came to Bali to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. But that leaves the largest carbon emission polluter in the world, the USA, out of the fold. And with millions of dollars pledged and millions as yet unpaid, critics are saying that this Bali conference is still too little, too late. Well, the US has made cautious commitments to the conference and played down the importance of binding targets.
We don't have to resolve all of these issues, these last items that I've mentioned to you here in Bali. What we need now is a solid Bali roadmap, one that sets the stage for robust, constructive, and groundbreaking negotiations in the months ahead.
But the former US Vice President Al Gore accused the US delegation of deliberately dragging its feet and dashing hopes of a binding agreement.
I am going to speak an inconvenient truth. My own country, the United States, is principally responsible for obstructing progress here in Bali. We all know that. We all know that.
Well, joining us now are guests in Washington, D.C., Dr. John Topping, President of the Climate Institute, and in Berlin, Dietrich Brockhagen, Managing Director of Atmosphere, an environmental NGO based in Germany. Welcome to the programme. John Topping in Washington, let me start with you, if I may. The main issue seems to be that the US won't commit to targets on emissions. What's behind this? Is it just short-sightedness?
Well, I think there's a short-sightedness there, perhaps at the national level, although the fortunate thing is quite a number of U.S. states are really getting very aggressive in the issue and are moving at the speed of some of the most aggressive countries abroad. But I think what's also encouraging is that industry and the financial community in the U.S. are really starting to recognize this, and they're looking for innovative solutions that would both cut greenhouse emissions and save money at the same time. They would apply in the United States, but they could apply abroad. I think the most encouraging is in what we call combined heat and power or cogeneration. And Denmark right now gets 50% of its electricity from cogeneration. In the United States, it's about 8%. This is the situation in most of the rest of the world, something like that. There's the potential for the United States to save $70 billion a year and to cut greenhouse emissions as much as 20% by developing much smarter rules for the electric power industry. And recently, a capital fund that Bill Gates and Harvard University are involved in very much, Denham, put $1.5 billion into an effort by a group, Recycled Energy Development in the U.S., headed by Tom Kasten, looking at projects of this sort. The same thing can apply worldwide.
All right.
And I think if we do this, it's a way that we can make real headway regardless of what's happening in the negotiations.
Okay, let's just bring in Dietrich Brockhagen in Berlin for a second. Dietrich Brockhagen, how much of a blow will it be if a deal isn't reached at this conference in Bali?
Oh, actually, it depends on what the major players make out of it. I think if the Europeans were bold enough, they could cut a deal anyway with developing countries. They just need to take more money in their hands and talk to China and India and Brazil on technology transfer, and then they can just throw the US out of the negotiations, or just don't care for them because they are not part of the COP process anyway. So if the Europeans were strong enough, they certainly could do progress with the rest of the world on their own, and it could be a significant process.
Well, let's go to the conference itself in Bali and talk to Chris Miller, who's director of Greenpeace Climate Campaign in the US. Chris, we're hearing that the talks now are close to collapse. What's the latest from the conference? Why are they deadlocked?
I've in fact just heard negotiators are still meeting at this hour here, and I've just heard that we have some new text from the negotiators, and it seems as though the Americans have been quite successful in nearly scuttling this deal. As you may know, much of the discussion here has been around whether developed countries would agree to a midterm range of roughly 25 to 40% reductions by 2020. I now understand that the U.S. has been successful in stripping that language and putting in its place simply voluntary pledge and review type language. So moving away from any sort of mandatory emission reductions and moving more towards, individual country voluntary actions. This is a huge blow to this process, and I think really puts at risk a positive outcome here in Bali.
Chris Miller, let me stay with you for a second, because the European Union is accusing the United States of blocking progress. I mean, how tense is the standoff at the moment?
I think it's a very tense standoff. I think you can sort of view this process as a complicated jigsaw puzzle, and you have to put all of the pieces together in order to get a final deal. And I think without the U.S. willing to agree to some sort of process that has, some sort of general range for emission reductions between now and 2020, I think the whole thing falls apart. I think Europe loses its will, and I think particularly the developing countries, China, India, the G77, are looking for the United States to step up here. And what we've learned tonight is, in fact, not only are they not stepping up, they appear to be stepping away.
Let's bring in back John Topping in Washington. John, this week marks 10 years since the Kyoto Agreement was signed. But does Kyoto really have the muscle to enforce its resolutions? Briefly, because we're just short of time.
It really doesn't. The enforcement mechanisms are very weak in Kyoto, and I think it's a real problem. We need something far more imaginative in the future, and that's why a real emphasis on such things as energy recycling that can produce large-scale reductions worldwide, but require in many cases much smarter rules, is a very good start for the United States, but the same thing would apply to the major developing countries. We really have three countries that have really had a remarkably positive record here. First, as I mentioned, Denmark and then Finland and the Netherlands are both generating more than a third of their power from this. This is something that can start right away, and I think it's important, that we get these things started before any U.S. election. The U.S. position will change in time, but we don't have time. We have evidence of melting of Greenland at a rapid pace and a reduced absorption of carbon dioxide in the oceans. There's a crisis ahead, and we can't wait for the negotiators.
Okay, let's bring in back Dietrich Brockhagen in Berlin. Dietrich, experts say that the Kyoto Protocol was very much a landmark process. I mean, has it been effective over the last 10 years, do you think?
Not in terms of emission reductions, but I think it still merits its reputation as a landmark because it has created a vehicle, and now it really depends on who takes place in the driving seat. And so far, nobody really was there to get it to speed. But yeah, at least it has created the right framework and the setting for meaningful negotiations. But yeah, a vehicle without a good driver is nothing.
Let's go back to Christopher Miller in Bali. Chris, the Kyoto Protocol targets expire, as we know, in 2012. So how important is it to agree what they're calling this Bali roadmap, which hopes to cut emissions even further?
It's crucially important. The fact is, this is a global problem, and there is no solution that doesn't include the world coming together to figure this out. You've got 190 some odd countries here, most of whom are prepared to sit down and negotiate in good faith to create a second commitment period, a second phase of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol has largely been a success. This is a first step along a long path, and most countries who have committed to binding emission reduction limits under the protocol will largely meet those goals. So if this is not the solution, I don't think anyone has a good idea of what it is. I think the countries that are here need to sit down, and particularly the United States. It's also true that Canada and Japan have been complicit in supporting the U.S. position here. But unless the parties come together and get an agreement here, I think this process falls apart, and that is a terrible thing for the climate and for the future of the planet.
Chris, let me just stay with you for 1 second before we go to break, because you mentioned the US there, and the US, of course, has lots of conflicting interests. Is there any pressure that can be brought on the US to make them commit to target deals?
I think that we have seen a sea change in the American public and in American business. The fact is, public opinion polls now in the U.S. show an overwhelming majority of Americans understand this problem and are looking to their elected leaders to solve it. Increasingly, American corporations understand that they're being locked out of a growing global carbon market. More than 27 Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. have come together to support a 60 to 80% reduction in the U.S. by mid-century. And as you know, the United States Senate passed out of committee just this week a bill that would reduce emissions in the U.S. 60% by 2050. So I think there is a growing sea change in the U.S. looking for action, and I think it is only the Bush administration that is well out of step with this.
Okay, we'll come back to that sea change a little bit later in the program. Gentlemen, stay with us, won't you? Because it's time for a short break. But when we come back, we'll be looking at individual efforts to fight climate change. And will that really make a difference? Stay with us.